Okay, we're recording. Hi, and welcome.
Hi.
I also want to just welcome everyone who will be watching in the ethers to this.
Yes, welcome everyone.
So excited for this conversation today with Lauren. Lauren is a certified yoga instructor and mental health coach who specializes in recovery from low self-esteem, disordered eating, addiction, depression, anxiety. Is there anything else too that you want to share about yourself as we begin?
Let's see. Yeah, I'm researching on getting my counseling degree because the longer that I am a yoga instructor, the more I realize how interlinked yoga and mental health is, at least in my experience. So yeah, I'm just on my journey to see how much I can contribute back to the community.
Beautiful. Okay, and we also have some like fun collaboration stuff that we're doing upcoming, which we'll share more about at some point, so people can keep an eye out for that. I'm super excited for that.
Yes, so exciting.
Should we do just a little grounding to begin?
Absolutely.
Also, I'm trying to get better about this, wanting to name, because I realize like not everybody watches the very first episode and into the next. And so wanting to just have a little space in the beginning to acknowledge the intention of this podcast, which is really podcast interview. Eventually it'll maybe be a podcast, which is really to one, just like break the stigma around addiction and also recovery and like normalize it, right? We live in one of the most addicted societies in history, and yet there's still so much stigma and shame around it, and really there shouldn't be. And so wanting to sort of bring these conversations that we as people in recovery are lucky to get to have within our circles all the time, but I feel like not everybody gets to have that gift, and so wanting to bring that out into the rest of the world. And then also the hope is really to inspire people to live a life of recovery that they love, because I know I feel this way and you feel this way, that like being sober is such a gift and actually so much fun. And the hope is that people can understand and learn to trust that for themselves in their own experience. So with that said, let's do a little grounding. Let's close our eyes. I like to do this in the beginning of these conversations because I honestly feel like we should just do this in the beginning of every conversation we ever have with people. Like it would transform the world to have a moment to ground before we connect. So noticing, and anyone who's watching can do this too, noticing the way our bodies are connected to support underneath us. Really a reminder ultimately that we're held every moment by Mother Earth. And then first, just taking a moment to notice the way in which we're naturally breathing without necessarily needing to change or fix anything. What parts of our body are moving, shifting to accommodate space for our breath. And then taking a breath in, and then slowing the exhale, just any amount, whatever feels natural and accessible to you. Following the exhale all the way to the bottom of your breath. Maybe pausing at the bottom, and when you're ready, taking another breath in. Slowing the exhale, maybe even a little bit more. And then one more breath, your own pace, just noticing that there's a beginning, middle, and end to your inhale. Beginning, middle, and end to your exhale. And then taking a moment to call to heart one thing you feel particularly grateful for in this moment. Perhaps noticing how bringing gratitude into our awareness has subtle effect on our physiology, a little bit of a difference in how we feel, or maybe not. Just noticing what's true for you. And when you're ready, eyes are closed, open them, and back to space.
Beautiful. I love that.
Me too. Feel always so much gratitude after it.
It's amazing how much can shift in like 1 minute.
It's so true. It's so true. When I work with people, like we will talk about that, right? Because I think we can have such rigid expectations of ourselves of like, oh, if I'm going to do something to ground myself, it needs to be like an hour-long practice or whatever. And it's like, it actually doesn't, if we don't have space for that, like that's okay. And sometimes it can just be a few minutes, and that few minutes totally can be transformative.
Yes, I completely agree. And I have a lot of personal evidence to back that up.
Me too. 100%. Okay. Well, so would love if you wanted to just start with sharing your story as much as you feel called to share.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for asking me to come on and share with you about recovery, all things recovery. Yeah, I mean, just starting a little bit from the beginning, I think it's, my history has really informed where I have landed or arrived right now. So I do like to share a bit about that. I grew up in LA, and both of my parents were alcoholics, addicts. And, I knew that my dad was an alcoholic from a really young age. And my mom, I didn't know until I was in my early teens. And hers progressed in sort of a very different way than my dad's did. It was very hidden. And yeah, I grew up in actually a really privileged place in LA in the Palisades. It was perfect. The lawns were perfect. There were white picket fences. Everyone looked beautiful. And on the inside, like, at least from what I witnessed, there was so much happening with, drug and alcohol use, disordered eating, just really, really bad stuff kind of happening, but it was all sort of underground and hidden with this really beautiful picture on the outside. So what mattered was how things looked on the outside. And yeah, so, I started my drinking using journey when I was in high school, like probably a lot of people. And it was really fun for a while. And I didn't see any kind of problem with it. My mom always warned me, you have a lot of alcoholics in your family, you need to be careful. And I was aware of that, but I had a lot of fun in my teenage years. And it was a really good, it was a solution for the, really bad feelings that I was having with all of this, trauma and stuff happening at home. It was a great solution. And what happened for me is that eventually the solution stopped working and I needed a different solution. And I consider myself really blessed that happened at quite a young age. So when I was 19, I lost my dad to alcoholism. And then, my mom's addiction had really taken off by that point. So there was just so much emotional pain that I kind of got to this fork in the road where I was like, okay, I can go harder into my drinking and using, or I can stop and get help. Because yeah, and I saw what happened to my mom and dad, and I didn't want that to be me. And so I knew where to go. I knew how to get help because I had seen my mom try to get help. So I landed in a 12-step fellowship, and I never really looked back after I, started getting sober. I was 20. I really dove into working the 12 steps and just really trying to change my life. And it was very much centered for me around alcohol. And you know, I was really worried, oh, what if I'm not an alcoholic because I didn't do this, I didn't do that. I still had all of these sort of, I didn't have that many consequences, which I think a lot of that was also privilege that I didn't recognize at the time. And that maybe if I didn't have that, I would have had consequences. But either way, I didn't have consequences. So I didn't really hit like an external bottom, as people like to call it, like a rock bottom. But internally, I felt spiritually bankrupt. And I remember looking in the mirror in my eyes and just feeling like this emptiness and like something, like there was no life there. So, when I got sober, like I said, it was really about alcohol. And I was kind of obsessed with this idea of, did I do enough to earn my seat in sobriety? And I was instructed to just, keep trying, stay here for a year, just see what happens. And by that time, my life had changed so much and I felt so much better that I didn't want to go anywhere and I didn't care if I was an alcoholic or not. And yeah, so from there, the journey has been, getting to know myself and healing deeper and deeper parts of my history and, learning new tools. And then also just going through my 20s sober. When I look back now, because I just turned 31 and I look through my 20s and, there were challenging parts. And at the time I was like, oh, maybe this wouldn't be so hard if I wasn't sober. But when I think about it, I'm like, I was just growing up, the pains of growing up. And yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe like having alcohol to numb that might have helped me in some ways, but I know that like the consequences weren't worth it for me because I did have an experience of, having a drink or a drug and not knowing what was going to happen next. Like maybe I can sit on my hands and kind of, not drink, but maybe I'm going to black out. I didn't know. And the longer I was drinking, the less control I had.
Totally.
So I did see that progression that you hear about.
Yeah.
So, do you have a question?
Oh no, I was just gonna say that makes me think of something that I've learned in 12 step is like the kind of two questions to ask of like whether or not we're an alcoholic, right? Which is like one, that when we try to control our drinking, we find that we can't, and two, that when we honestly want to stop, like we find that we can't. And so it's like you're kind of naming those two qualities, right? And so I just am appreciating what you're sharing, because I think that so many people have the same kind of inquiry process where they're like, oh, but maybe I'm not an alcoholic because I don't have this consequence, or this thing hasn't happened to me yet, or oh, I know this alcoholic and this is what their life looks like and my life doesn't look like that, so I must not be an alcoholic. But really what you're speaking to, and what I think is like the important kind of question to be asking when you're considering if you're an alcoholic, is like, am I am I profoundly suffering inside, and am I using alcohol to like cope with that suffering, right? It's like, because it's the inside stuff that's like, the drinking is but a symptom, right? We talk about that as like the drinking is only a symptom, and really like there's deeper things inside that are needing healing, and we're using alcohol or drugs or whatever the thing may be to cope with that. And sometimes I think I witness that it can take people a lot longer to get sober. I also believe that like it takes what it takes, and everybody has their own path to be on. But like I also feel like I see that there are some people who it takes them such a long time to get sober because they're only like looking at the external stuff, right? Where they're like, this thing hasn't happened to me yet, so it must not be a problem for me to the degree that it is for alcoholics, right? But it's really the inside job, and that's what you're talking about. So I just appreciate that.
Yes, I am so happy that you sort of zoomed in on that, because that's something that I try to share, you know, when I share my story in meetings or other places, or, you know, with people that I work with, is like, it doesn't matter what the external looks like. And that's why I think, you know, in 12-step literature, it talks about that we're a group that normally wouldn't mix. And I think that that's so true, because the externals can be so different.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. Where was I?
So sorry. I was like, I had a
It's
moment.
okay.
Interrupt her or not? Because you were like in the zone, and I didn't want to disrupt that.
No, I'm happy that you did. Okay, so I guess I was talking about just my journey in recovery since getting sober. So obviously a lot has happened in over 10 years. You know, I graduated college, and I had gone to college in Oregon, which is how we were able to connect actually through a friend. And then I went back to LA, and I was sort of on this mission to accomplish and succeed as a way to give myself worth. And when I was 3 years sober, I had sort of a mental emotional bottom where I realized that I needed to be on medication for my depression and anxiety. And I also really try to make a point of sharing that in my story, because I think there's such a stigma around it, maybe less so now than there was, 10 years ago, but it was hard for me. I thought that if I was taking prescribed medication that I wasn't sober. And it took a doctor telling me that not taking my medication was like somebody with diabetes not taking their insulin, for example. And when it was presented to me like that, like a medical need, I just gained a really new perspective about it. And it helped me to, I had done everything that I was supposed to be doing at that point to be sober and happy. And there was something missing for me, and I needed some extra support. And after that, I still, like, the drive for success was still on. And it took, working in entertainment for about 5 years and completely burning myself out to realize that, it wasn't going to give me what I thought it was going to give me. Like, I thought that by getting, all of this money and being, going up the corporate ladder and getting applause and, oh, your job's so cool, that I would feel better about myself. And obviously at the time I didn't realize that's why I was doing it. But yeah, I sort of hit a bottom there too, where I realized, like, I'm chasing something that's not going to give me what I want. Yes. Because what I want is contentment, serenity, joy, like the ability to be okay with all of my feelings and be in my body and connect with others. And it was doing the opposite. Yes. Sort of that same thing of like externally validating, right?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I relate. I had my story is just a little bit different in that I was I hadn't been sober, but I also had the same thing where I was like, okay, so I'm gonna graduate from a good college. I'm gonna get that like really cool job in the art world that's like high paying and like people will think that I'm so cool and I'll get accolades and blah 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 and like I'll climb the ladder of the art world and like that will be success and that success will give me happiness and it is like it's such a lie, right? Which is not to say like those things can't bring joy and fulfillment, but like again, kind of going back to what you just touched on, which is that like if we're not tending to our inner life, like and we're expecting the outside things to make the inside feel okay, like that's where we're missing the mark. And yet, you know, the fact that we both have had that experience, I feel like means that it's just unfortunately such a universal one and really like a patriarchal one, right?
Totally.
So yeah. So you hit that kind of.
Yeah. And by the way, sometimes I feel like when I share that, it sounds like I think everyone should denounce like corporation or just maybe not corporation is the right word because that probably would be a good thing, but denounce like the 9-to-5 life. That's totally not what I'm saying. I'm just sharing that in my experience, I needed to get out of that in order to go inward in a meaningful way, because what happened is that once I left that world, I realized how much my value and identity was tied in with my job, and I felt like I had nothing. So it was sort of another moment of this spiritual bankruptcy of I've put all of my energy into these external things. And then as soon as I left, somebody took my place. I was a cog in the wheel, which it's like, that's fine if you know that, you know, but I didn't know that. I thought that I was really important and really specifically needed for that job. So my value crumbled when that crumbled. And and I didn't realize how much anxiety I was living with. It was almost like a tool. I used my anxiety to get me through being available 24/7 for my CEO boss, you know?
Totally.
And my nervous system was totally wrecked. Like anytime my boss would come out of his office and just be like, hey, I would jump because I was so on edge all the time.
Yes.
And anyway, so what ended up happening is that I lost my mom to cirrhosis of the liver from alcoholism about 3 years ago. And I, at that was the point at which I realized that, that the job wasn't giving me what I thought that I was hoping to get from it. And my partner and I came to Bali for a vacation to visit his sponsor. And because he's also sober about 15 years.
Amazing.
So we came here to visit this guy, and I had never met them before, him and his partner. And we got here and I had the best time, and I was like, let's move here. And my partner was like, no. And then he ended up coming around and saying, okay, let's do it. And he's the kind of person where like when he decides something, he's doing it and it's done. And so by the time he decided he wanted to do it, I was like, well, I don't know. That was rash. We were on vacation. And he was like, well, I'm going. So
wow,
you're coming with me or you're not. And it just, we had planned to move in May. So that was like 8 months or a year after we had gone on the vacation. And we ended up having a situation that sort of just pushed us out the door and made us, it was like now or never. So we ended up moving a few months early in January. We got our pets out here, and and that was the point at which I had quit my job and realized that I was spiritually bankrupt. And my first year here was really hard. A lot of my sort of coping mechanisms came out that I didn't really realize were there. So, you know, a lot of disordered eating behaviors that had previously been sort of manageable in a way became really unmanageable. And I felt trapped. I felt like I couldn't leave if I wanted to because my dogs were here and my partner was here. And at the time, I hated that, you know, but looking back, I'm so happy that I felt that I couldn't leave because it forced me to go on this inward journey. So in my time in Bali, which, like I said before, I don't think that you need to move to Bali to have an inward journey.
It sounds like a great idea.
Yeah. I, you know, really, I found a yoga practice and I started going to therapy and just being really honest and looking at things in a deeper way, which I think it is more possible when the external things aren't there to soothe, because it just makes everything come out and then you're left with this table of things to look at, you know? So it's a blessing, but it's not really comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I found my yoga practice, which really helped me to recover from my disordered eating because it helped me to get into my body. You know, I somehow ended up living with another sober girl who was involved in the HAES, or Health at Every Size, body respect community. And she taught me so much about how to, you know, screw diet culture and reclaim my body. And it was really just this culmination of, you know, amazing coincidences kind of all at the same time to help me grow. And through, you know, recovering from all of those things, I have really I've felt called to share that with other people. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of where we're at today.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. I mean, there's just everything you've shared is so rich, and I feel like there's like so many threads we could pull out. One of the things that also just came to mind that I want to touch on, because I think that this is such a common experience, is like you naming that you felt trapped and how actually profound it was for you to in a sense have to stay, because I think that that's something that's so common for people who are battling with whatever their addiction is they're like, it's like a geographic, right? Like, oh, it's this place that's the problem. And so if I leave this place, like, then I'll be okay. Or if I, and so, and sometimes totally that's true. Like I always too, and I've noticed that you're doing this also, but feel like wanting to make sure that I'm not communicating in a way that feels rigid, because really everything is so nuanced and like there's no one size fits all or one right way. And so like, so I'm all to say that I'm not saying that sometimes moving isn't beneficial for recovery, but also sometimes there are times in which people will think that moving will change the thing, and really that's not necessarily going to be how it works. And so that you had that like really it like embodied experience of like, oh, I have to actually stay here and like look at these other layers, right? Because also you've been in recovery and done so much work, and so that's also something that I'm wanting to maybe just parse out a little and expand on, is that it's like the layers of the onion, right? Where like we might come into recovery initially and be like, oh, alcohol is my problem, or drugs are my problem, and that is the issue to begin with. And yet the more we recover, the more we start to recognize that there's actually so many layers to the experience that we're having, that's really kind of like causing continued suffering, right? And that's also like what recovery gets to be, is like slowly peeling away those layers that are keeping us suffering, and like so that we can get to the essence of who we truly are. And so I love that you're, yeah, really showing through your story that there is this trajectory in which the longer you've stayed sober, the more you've actually gotten to peel back layers and layers that you couldn't possibly have seen in the beginning, right? Because you have to get through things layer by layer.
I love that you say that, because yes, I've heard a lot of people say, you know, don't quit before the miracle happens. And I always thought it was just getting sober. And it's like, actually, if I quit at any time, I'm quitting before the miracle happens, because there are so many miracles. There are so many gifts, you know?
Yes, absolutely. So, so true. Yes, I love that. You know, I'm always like, anytime I talk to anybody who will listen, I'm just like sobriety is like so incredible. And also like, there's just so much to it, right? Like, I feel like sometimes when people hear about sobriety, unless they're maybe in recovery communities and have been for a period of time, it's like you think of sobriety and you think of it as like, oh, sobriety means not drinking. But like really, sobriety is like a personal journey of the most profound transformation ever, and also not drinking, like, and also healing your like interpersonal relationships, and also like developing a relationship with something bigger than like there's so much more to it than just like not drinking. And
Yes.
yeah, and so I love that you talk about the like, yeah, it's like don't quit before the miracle happens, and that there's just so many miracles, and that's why we ultimately keep going, right? And I so feel that way too about recovery. Like, and I remember in the beginning for me, I was like, I'll stay sober for a year and like see what happens. But you said this in your story too, where you're just like, after a period of time, like I just felt so much better. You were like, that it didn't matter whether I was an alcoholic or not or whatever. But it's like the same thing for me, where it's like after a period of time and getting through the kind of initial early recovery that has its own set of like immense challenges and difficulties and also beautiful gifts, it was like, oh, my life is so much better that I just can't, I have to keep going, because if it's already this much better, like what lies ahead? And there's so much
Yes.
like beautiful mystery and excitement in that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, in that vein, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about just the different paths to recovery, because I know, you know, in the conversations that we've gotten to have, we've talked about how 12-step has been such an important part of our recovery. And then also you named in your story that eventually, as you peeled back more layers, it's like other avenues of support became really vital to your recovery, like yoga and therapy. And the what did you name about the body, the disordered eating, HAES, and what did you call that? Love your body? What did,
I think I said body respect.
body respect.
Right?
Yes, yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I guess just after being sober for a while, I have seen a lot of people recover in different ways. So, you know, if we're looking at a 12-step fellowship, then I've seen people recover in a million different ways within that, you know, with working the 12 steps. And a lot of times I think you can run into people who say that there's one way to do the 12 steps or one way to get sober. And I really, I was one of those people for a long time. And just through lived experience, I've come to believe that there are a lot of different ways. And like I said, in a 12-step fellowship, there are so many different books and literature that's been written since, you know, the 30s, when the first book was written for Alcoholics Anonymous. And like, yeah, I'm reading a book right now called Woman's Way Through the 12 Steps. And it's amazing because she really goes in on each step and talks about those words with, and I honestly think this book was written in the 90s, so still possibly outdated in some ways. I think that it could work for anybody who's sort of been marginalized, not just women.
Yeah.
Because in each chapter, she really breaks down those words that kind of give you that funny feeling. You know, like in the first step, it talks about powerlessness. And I think as a woman, or maybe as somebody from a marginalized community, that might feel like, well, I'm already so powerless in all of these ways. And the steps were written by white men, so who were probably Christian, I think for sure Christian. So it makes sense that maybe for that group of people, like that word would probably be really necessary. However, I think that we can kind of shift the language and understanding of the word to like help it make more sense of, I'm powerless over alcohol, but that doesn't mean that I'm powerless. It actually knowing that gives me empowerment.
Absolutely. Totally. Sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, that's within the 12 steps. And I think also outside of the 12 steps, there are so many different ways of finding recovery. And I think right now there's such a big sort of movement of people wanting to get sober who aren't necessarily identifying as an alcoholic. And I think that that's so beautiful because it's like people are waking up, And yeah, something that we've talked about is, in 12-step fellowships, we have our triangle, which is unity, recovery, and service. And I equate it as body, mind, and spirit. So again, if we're talking 12-step only, unity would be going to meetings and creating an honest and vulnerable, intimate community. And then recovery would be working the 12 steps, which would help your mind to recover. And then service, is connecting with some kind of higher power or spirit through being of service or, helping others. Or I also include in that meditation and prayer. And then you can take those ideas, body, mind, and spirit, and use other modalities to accomplish the same thing. Like in yoga, for example, all of those are addressed. We have yoga asana, we have prayer and meditation, we have self-study.
Totally. And even we have we have bhakti yoga, which is like the yoga of devotion as another way of connecting to spirit. And we have jnana yoga, which is like the yoga of knowledge. And that's kind of like the discussion of like the 8-limbed path. And so it's like, yeah, it totally relates in a sense to like 12 step, in the sense that like 12 step is a framework, right? Like 12 step are 12 steps that help you to get sober. And then in the same way, like the 8-limbed path are like 8 limbs that support you in attaining enlightenment, right? Or samadhi, bliss, and unity with something greater than you. And so it is so cool how there's so many parallels. And I just love that you're speaking to that, because I think that, yeah, there's a lot of kind of stigma around 12-step stuff, but really what, at the end of the day, what we're speaking to is our spiritual principles. And spiritual principles can be found in so many multitudes of realms. And I love, yeah, that just you're naming that there are therefore many paths to recovery, right? And I had the same experience. Like I got sober largely with 12-step, and I feel such a profound respect and gratitude for 12-step programs, and I still participate in them today. And over the course of my 6+ years of recovery, I also have witnessed that there's there's lots of different ways to experience recovery. And the yoga piece for me has also been so profound, and a piece that was missing in other aspects of my recovery, like 12-step, for example, like the embodiment piece, right? Like we have gotten to have conversations about that, but just how profound the healing that has come from coming back into our bodies after being disconnected from like most of my life. And we're taught that in a lot of ways too, right? To be disconnected from our bodies. The mind is so glorified in our culture, and like intelligence and wit and like all of these things, and which is all beautiful and valuable to be sure. And yet like our body is so incredibly wise, and learning how to value my body, and in the same way, and maybe just a little bit of a different path, like you have also been learning how to value your body, like that has become at this point in my recovery, right? Like, because at this point in my recovery, drinking and using aren't a thing for me anymore. Like I just never, the obsession has been removed from me. I don't ever think about that. Like no matter what happened to me in my life, like I know with absolute certainty that I would never need to drink or use over it. Like that's just not, so what my recovery looks like today is so much more of like that embodiment piece of like learning how to actually like recover my wholeness as a person, which means coming back into this sacred vessel that for so long I treated like shit and ignored and learned to override. And I think culturally we're also encouraged to do that in some ways, right? Like in a patriarchal world, like we need to keep the productivity moving. And so who cares if you're burned out, like still keep working. Don't listen to the fact that you're exhausted. Don't take that nap. Like don't eat that thing because you need to look a certain way based on like what we're taught in like magazines and fashion and like blah, blah, blah. And so there are just so many ways that we're taught to dismiss the inherent value and messaging of our bodies. And so that's, to me, is the part of recovery that feels so exciting now.
Mm. Yes, I love that you touched on that, and sort of taking a little bit of a path from what you're saying about, coming back into the body is, I feel very passionately about this body respect and recovery from disordered eating or body image issues, because, being sober for a long time, I have seen probably, my experience is mostly with women because I usually, work with women in recovery. So I can't really speak to everybody, but I've seen probably almost every woman that I have spoken to have some kind of form of disordered eating or, body dysmorphia that comes up after getting sober. And I don't really know like the science behind that. I've heard that it's, disordered eating and addiction are sort of linked in the area of the brain. I can't confirm that scientifically, but that's what I've heard. But I think it's really just this, it's this sort of replacement for, okay, I can't numb through drinking and using, so I'm gonna, try and control my food intake, control how my body looks, and that's going to help me to feel more in control of my life. And it's really, in my experience, disordered eating is all happening in the mind. Mm. And so I didn't even realize how much I was recovering from that by just having a yoga practice, a yoga asana practice, because it helped me come back into feeling what was actually happening in my body. And now, that intuitive connection, I think it just gets stronger. It's kind of like a muscle. And the more that I use it, the more I can hear what my body is trying to tell me. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't, because I used to run everything through this filter of, if I eat this, then that means that I can't have that. Or if I eat this, this means that I'm, a bad person because I'm contributing to whatever kind of world problem. Just all these rules and regulations that were so restrictive. And, the first step for that, for me was like, I had to take off all of my food rules. Mm. So that I could experience that freedom and like lack of restriction. And then eventually I came to a place of like most of the time craving quote unquote healthy foods because they feel good.
That's so great. Yeah. If you had any like for somebody who's maybe just kind of beginning a body respect journey and has perhaps disordered eating tendencies, do you have any like, what would be kind of the first steps or suggestions that you might offer in the way of beginning to heal that?
That's a great question. For me, my journey actually started by listening to this podcast called Food Psych. You can find it on any place where you hear podcasts. And it's with this woman, Christy Harrison. She's an anti-diet dietitian. And she also wrote a book called Anti-Diet, which I highly recommend. It's sort of a condensed version of her over 200 episodes of, podcasts. And it's just a really great way to begin becoming educated about where diet culture came from and realizing that it really isn't about, like, it didn't come from within us. It came from, marketing and external sources, and people are profiting off of our pain. So knowing that, and being somebody who's interested in social justice, that really helped me to kind of not want to engage in that anymore. And also finding a practice which gets you into your body, I think would be a really good place to start. And depending on, the severity of the issues that you're experiencing, probably, I have found, therapy or coaching to be really helpful with somebody who has HAES aligned principles. So that's health at every size aligned principles, just because I think that somebody who's HAES aligned is going to guarantee sort of a safe path back into the body. And I'm sure most therapists and coaches are well-intentioned. However, diet culture seeps into every single facet of the world. So that includes medical spaces and, counseling and coaching spaces. So it's just, with something so sensitive, I always suggest to just be safe about it and find someone who's, registered as a HAES aligned therapist.
Yes, those are such great suggestions. Thank you for that. Yeah, and then I touch in. I feel like we've actually been on a good roll, and I'm like, okay, but not wanting to take up too much more of your time. But to kind of close, wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you understand and relate to a higher power today. And I've actually been asking this of everybody, and I don't think I've named, and so I want to name, but the reason that I'm asking is because I find that working with people in recovery, this is the biggest sticking point for so many people, is struggling to feel a connection to something bigger than us. And I think that part of that is that we're fed perhaps a lot of ideas of what a higher power is supposed to look like, either through like religious experiences that maybe don't resonate, which is not, I feel careful to say that because I don't want to denounce religion, because I think that there are so many beautiful aspects of religion. And the experience that I've had is that a lot of people can struggle perhaps because they were fed an idea of a higher power that doesn't actually resonate with them. And so maybe they've kind of rejected that altogether and then don't know where to start, or just that languaging around what that looks like. And also we're just not kind of, things like ritual and ceremony and prayer and stuff like that is not necessarily taught. I mean, I think that we also like work in wellness world. So I feel like I'm like a little bit in a vacuum at this point, but from prior to that being my reality, I know that I didn't readily have access to those kinds of things as practices. They weren't talked about, and a relationship to a higher power wasn't really talked about in a way that made sense to me. And so when I first got sober, I was like, I don't even know what that looks like, or how do I do that? How do I connect? I don't know how I even define that. And so I'm enjoying asking people on these conversations their experience, so as to hopefully inspire some people to think about a relationship to a higher power in a way that maybe they haven't. So if you could just share a little bit about yours, that would be great.
Yes, I love this question. So actually, I feel like it's quite related for me to some other things we've talked about. So kind of going from the beginning of my sobriety, I did develop a meditation practice, which helped me to kind of get my mind out of the way and, be a little bit more present. But I think largely, probably for most of my sobriety, I did not feel connected to a higher power. And that changed in the last few years because of my yoga practice. And the reason for that is not because I have some new sort of like mental conceptual idea of a higher power, but it's because I've come back into my body and realized my connection with the things around me. So, it was really hard for me to get a Catholic Christian God out of my head because I had gone to Catholic school as a kid and it did not resonate for me. But, when you're looking at theology books with pictures of white Jesus for years and years, that's going to be like the thing that's in your head. And it's kind of hard to get that out. Yes. And I'm happy that you said that you don't want to denounce any kind of religion, because I also don't want to do that. It was just my personal experience that did not work for me. And, I tried all kinds of things through sobriety of meditation and like ideas of, people talked about making like different celebrities their higher power and like making the 12-step fellowship their higher power. And I think that it's just sort of a journey and we have to kind of take one step at a time and allow it to sort of unfold. But for me, the connection really started once I was able to come back into my body and feel this sort of existential awareness of like something created this and it's so incredible. And something created like all of the things around me, and just feeling this sort of innate connection with all of that by connecting in through the body.
Absolutely.
Does that sound, I feel like it sounds way out there.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it does to some people. To me, I'm just like, yes, 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 yes. Yeah, I completely relate. It actually, when you were talking, made me think of this line from a David Whyte poem that I love so much, where he writes, to feel abandoned is to deny the intimacy of our surroundings. And so like, and I just, that line always stands out to me because I too, like, that's so much of how I understand God or spirit, universal energy, life force, like whatever language makes sense to you. But it's like, yeah, like literally there is life in all things, and it's almost, and when we're really paying attention and when we're embodied, it's like life is constantly inviting us into relation, into conversation with it, and like, are we available to that? And so in times too where I also have felt not connected to a higher power, or cut off in that way, it's like, it's in the kind of, when I boil it down to its essence, it's like I'm feeling disconnected from life. And so I think even, and this is just kind of coming to us as we're having this conversation, but it's like, perhaps if somebody is struggling with the idea of like God, it's maybe then even just replacing it with a question of like, how can I feel more connected to life, period. And that maybe that feels more accessible, because I totally agree that that's what it is to me, is like when I feel connected to a higher power is when I'm able to access the truth that I'm sacred, everything around me is sacred, this conversation that we're having is sacred, because literally, like, not only are we each sacred as humans, but like we'll never in this exact moment in time, in this exact like constellation, like come together again. And so it's like this moment is here, and like that in and of itself is so sacred. Like the trees are sacred, like the love that we get to share with people is sacred. And it's like even just attuning to that sacredness is perhaps a way to attune to a higher power. And yet when we're disconnected from our body, it's like our body is the bridge that helps us to be able to recognize that. And so I just love that that's your experience, because really it's kind of like that's also my experience, but I've maybe never said it in that way. But then we're having this conversation and I'm just like, oh yes, that's what it is.
Wow, I love that so much. Yes, thank you for sharing your experience about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing yours. So good. Such a beautiful conversation. I'm so glad that we're doing this, and also just so excited for all of the things that we have upcoming in collaboration as well.
Me too. Yes. I feel like, through connecting with the body and therefore sort of some kind of higher power, that helps me get in touch with my intuition. And by getting in touch with my intuition, it kind of defines my values. And I feel like my values are more defined than they ever have been. And having conversations with you, I've been amazed with how much I feel our values and sort of goals are aligned. So I'm super grateful for this conversation and for, yes, our upcoming collaborations.
Yes, me too. Me too. And then also, I'm just feeling called to tack on one more quick thing, which is that if there was like something that you would want, some kind of a message that you would want to leave with somebody who is perhaps newly sober and looking for just something to keep them going through the day, like a glimmer of hope.
So I think that probably the most important thing that we've talked about, in my opinion, is, for somebody who's newly sober or maybe like curious about getting sober, is that you don't have to sort of put yourself in this box of, identifying as an alcoholic or having these sort of external circumstances validate. And the same thing goes, I think, for, disordered eating. If or just anything, if you're not fully happy with a part of your life, if that's your relationship with alcohol, your relationship with food in your body, your mental health, that there's a solution. There are many solutions, and you can find recovery. And it doesn't matter how you look compared to other people. If you want to change it, it's something that is in your power to change if you reach out and ask for help.
Yes, yes. I couldn't have, yeah, so beautifully said. Thank you so much. Yes. And yeah, I'm learning to also like thank you to everyone in the ethers for joining. It's such a funny thing, right? Like this technology that we have that's so beautiful and valuable in so many ways. And also I'm like, how do we still make it feel like community? And so just wanting to also thank everybody who's watching for being here. And thank you so much, Lauren, for being here. This was such a rich conversation and I so look forward to more. And I hope that you have a beautiful, you're like, it's morning for you, early morning. So
The sun was coming up during our conversation.
totally. I hope you have a beautiful rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.
It's good. Bye.